story today. We look at Joseph. If you have your Bibles, if you'd open up to Genesis chapter 37. We also have the passages up on the screen, but we're going to cover a lot of material. Basically what this is three different events that take place in the life of Joseph, and probably events that we can identify with, perhaps not as in depth as they were for Joseph, but things just didn't work out right according to normal expectations for life. But the thing to keep track of is God's dream through all of this. What is it that God wants as the story unfolds in front of us? And then what examples can we apply to ourselves as we look at God working then, taking the time to record it for us to learn from others who've gone before us? And how do we make application to ourselves? What kind of hope does that give to us? And so we start off Genesis 37. I want to read verses 1 through 11. Jacob lived in the land where his father had stayed, the land of Canaan. This is the account of Jacob. Joseph, a young man of 17, was tending the flocks with his brothers, the sons of Bilhah and the sons of Zilpah, his father's wives. And he brought their father a bad report about them. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons, because he had been born to him in his old age. And he made a richly ornamented robe for him. When his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Joseph had a dream, and when he told it to his brothers, they hated him all the more. He said to them, "Listen to this dream I had. We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." His brothers said to him, "Do you intend to reign over us? Will you actually rule us?" And they hated him all the more because of his dream and what he had said. Then he had another dream, and he told it to his brothers. "Listen," he said, "I had another dream. And this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." When he told his father as well as his brothers, his father rebuked him and said, "What is this dream you had? Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" His brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the matter in mind. Again, reminder, we see the lower story. We see the events of our day-to-day lives. And here is a family, and a family has disagreements. They have squabbles with one another. Sometimes we can make those things worse. A favorite son, he's the youngest son. He's made a special coat that identifies him even more so as the special son. 10 of them are out in the field working. Joseph is not. Joseph goes and checks up on them and then comes back and tattles on his brothers and gives his father a bad report. So if things were not bad enough in Joseph just being the favorite, they continue to get worse and worse with the circumstances and the choices that they make. But still, through imperfect people, God's upper story is taking place. What God wants is a relationship with us. What he wants in this story, God wants a relationship with Joseph. He wants a relationship with Jacob. He wants a relationship with the 10 brothers. He wants a relationship with all of us. And consistently, the same thing is asked of us: to be faithful, to live a life of faith, to walk by trust, and with this, obedience. Now, to get to this point in the book of Genesis, last week we looked at Abraham, and we found out Abraham, even though he was chosen by God, Abraham was not a perfect person. He sinned, had his wife lie on a couple of occasions in order to save his own life. But then finally, he has a son in his old age. His son is named Isaac. Again, Isaac is the son of promise. Through him, his descendants, all peoples on the earth will be blessed. So God is doing something big through this family, but Isaac, he also is a troubled person. When he has children, He has a favorite son, the older, Esau. His wife has a favorite, Jacob. There's deception that they pull on each other. And again, I encourage you to go back and read the story if you've not already. It would be a phenomenal soap opera on television. You know, it's so true to life, but God is not trying to hide the fact that we're sinners. When we open the Bible and we read about people that God uses, they're people just like us. They're people completely dependent upon God in order to have a relationship with God. And so Abraham, he's not perfect. Isaac is not perfect. Isaac's son, Jacob, through whom the promise is going to be made, he's not perfect. Altogether, he has 12 sons. The point that we read, there's 11 so far. Joseph is his favorite. All the problems that's created by this. And then we come back to Genesis 37. So Joseph's brothers, they hate him. You know, they can't stand him. Once again, he's going out to where it is that they're working. I'm sure he's wearing his fancy coat. You know, as he's coming up on them, perhaps they're not doing like they should be. You know, they're going to get caught again. He's going to give them a bad report, whatever. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them near Dothan. But they saw him in the distance, and before he reached them, they plotted to kill him. Here comes that dreamer, they said to each other. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams. Well, that's some serious hate. Is that they're going to kill, or at least they're talking about killing, their baby brother. Their little brother. Well, one of the brothers doesn't care for this idea. He doesn't want to kill him. He knows his father loves the youngest. He cares about his father. Perhaps he cares about himself. And so there's enough conscience that's there. He talks him into throwing Joseph into a cistern with the hopes that he'll sneak back later and rescue Joseph. So at least let's spare his life at this point. Don't kill him yet. Well, before Reuben is able to come back and rescue his brother, the other 10, they decide to sell him to the Ishmaelites. And so Joseph's brothers sell their brother. You know, it's like if we kill him, you know, we got to go home until Daddy's dead. Plus, we killed somebody, and we don't get anything out of this. But you know what? If we sell him, maybe if we sell him for a lot, now we got to split it up 10 ways. You know, there's 10 brothers here, so it's not going to go a long way. But at least maybe we can make a little bit of a profit, you know, out of our little brother when we sell him. So they sell him to the Ishmaelites. Then the Ishmaelites, they travel on to Egypt. Egypt's sort of the center of the world. You know, that's where all the money is, where the commerce is coming in and out of. And so the Ishmaelites are going there, and their plan is to sell Joseph. And sure enough, they get there, and they sell him to an official of the king, of Pharaoh. They sell him to a guy by the name of Potiphar. Potiphar is Joseph's owner. So think about it. He's a foreigner in the happening place of Egypt. And then on top of that, he's a slave living there. So he's almost as low as he possibly could get, but he's not the lowest yet. There's still room to go down in the story for Joseph. But at least at this point, though, keep in mind, this is a 17-year-old guy. So imagine for a moment, I mean, at my age right now, I'm trying to think if somebody sold, people that I loved and trusted, you know, my older brothers, and they sell me to some foreigners who happen to be traveling by, and then they carry me to a distant land and sell me. And so as a 17-year-old, this is taking place with Joseph. You know, he gets there, he's sold, he's now a servant in somebody's house, but we see in the account the Lord was with Joseph and he prospered. So Joseph continued to trust God. You know, I don't know what exactly that looked like. I don't know how he was able to pull that off, but he trusted God, he was faithful to God, he sought to honor God in the circumstances that he found himself in. In Potiphar's house, he moves up through the ranks, he becomes an attendant to Potiphar, until finally, we see in the last part of this passage, Potiphar put him in charge of his household, and he entrusted to his care everything that he owned. So here's a 17-year-old guy who's now a slave. He gets into this guy's home, and he works his best, his hardest, and he rises up to where he's the number 3 person in this house. You know, there's Potiphar, there's Potiphar's wife, And the next after them, Joseph is in charge of everything in the house. Satan, he hates faithful people. Whether you're 17 years old or 70 years old or wherever, he just hates it when we're faithful to God.
Amen.
And so we pick up the story here. One day he, that is Joseph, went into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants was inside. Potiphar's wife had already been throwing herself at him. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But he left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. In the dialogue portions, we see that Joseph says this would be wrong. Number one, because it would wrong his master, Potiphar. But then secondly, it would be wrong in the eyes of God. Don't we sort of rationalize? I've been sold into, I was a good person, I did everything I was supposed to with God, and then sold into slavery. I'm in a foreign land. Who's going to know? I've been given this responsibility. She made sure the house was cleaned out. There's nobody else here. So, this is not going to be so bad. Maybe it's right in their culture. Again, we rationalize all kinds of stuff. Instead, no, it's not right in the eyes of God. No, it's not right in the eyes of my master. Well, when she saw that he had left his cloak in her hand and had run out of the house, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to them, "this Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed." So he rejects her, but then she turns the story around and says he advanced on her. He's attempting to rape her, and she screamed, and as a result of her screaming, then he runs out of the house. Well, when Potiphar finds this out, he sides with his wife. Who's going to side with their servant, no matter how much they like them? And so regardless of whether you believe, we don't have any kind of dialogue about that. Just Potiphar knew what he had to do. But it's telling, though, because I think he could put him to death right at that moment. He could have put him in the worst of dungeons, but instead Joseph is put in prison, but it's a prison where Pharaoh's officials are put. So maybe it's more of an upscale prison. I don't know. But for Joseph, he's now found his way to the lowest point in Egyptian society. He's a foreigner. He's a sheep herder. And so they just don't want to associate with sheep herders at all. They just soon spit on you as to look at you. So foreigner, a sheep herder, he's a slave, sold into slavery, bought, purchased, and now on top of all of that, he's a prisoner in prison. And so he has reached rock bottom in their society. But we pick up in the account of while Joseph was there in the prison, the Lord was with him. He showed him kindness and granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. For us, I would want that to say, God showed me favor and got me out of prison. Somehow it worked out like that. I don't want to be in prison. But Joseph is still there, but he's consistent. He's still faithful to God. He's still obedient to God. He showed him kindness, granted him favor in the eyes of the prison warden. So the warden put Joseph in charge of all those held in the prison. And he was made responsible for all that was done there. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Joseph is a phenomenal person of faith. I'm guessing a guy in his 20s, probably in his early 20s at this point. We don't know. We just know he's somewhere between 17 and 30 when this is happening. But again, he's seeking to honor God. Whatever responsibilities he has in the prison, he's working at it his best, giving it everything that he's got. And the Lord blessed his faithfulness. Now, for us, I think pain avoidance is the way that we approach life. Now, with some things that make sense. A hot burner, I don't want to stick my hand on that hot burner. It's cool looking, it's red. I stick other stuff on it, maybe, and watch what happens. But I don't want to stick my hand on there because I don't want to suffer the pain. as a result of being burned. Traffic. Hate being in traffic. So how hard do we work to find an alternate route? We're coming up on an exit, and the traffic's all backed up in front of us, and so we hop off on that exit, and it takes us through downtown Stafford, and we've done it many times before. It just takes forever to get through there. And in our efforts to try to avoid pain, sometimes we bring more pain on ourselves. Now that's actually the DC metro area right here. You notice everything in red. And I found that online. That was actually during one of the big snowstorms we had. So that's a real picture of what traffic looked like. And you remember some of those like that, where just like everything was shut down. But that'd be a pretty painful day. And I'm sure some endured that painful day. You're trying to get home in the middle of a blizzard. But then there are other occasions, such as like with the needle or other things, where pain avoidance, it's actually not in our best interest. So we grasp and understand that sometimes there's a need for pain in order for it to be beneficial. If you do anything with weights, I've heard that could be painful, if you work out with them and stuff. I tried it once, it didn't hurt. But we know, though, there are things in our lives that there has to be pain. So again, no pain, no gain. Sort of the idea that's there. But still, for us, in this place really of luxury where we live, we pretty much spend all of our time trying to avoid pain. And it's not just physical pain, but even the pain of being in uncomfortable situations. And so when we know something's right, we don't do what's right because we'll feel too awkward, because we're the only one in the group that's doing it right. Things like that. When it comes to sharing our faith, that can be kind of painful. Again, I'm sure it's a mild pain in relation to other things. Still, we work so hard to avoid those awkward situations and those painful situations. And so pain avoidance has become a way of life for us. What we need to do is come back and remember what's going on in our lives. We've made Jesus Lord of our lives. And so it's not my life anymore. And so pain avoidance, that's not the task at hand. But rather, my life is about a relationship with the Lord. That's why we were created in the first place. And the responsibility that I have in this relationship is to walk by faith. It's to trust God and to trust Him enough, not that I just believe stuff in my head, but that the actions are there. It's a real, living faith. And that's what we see in the example with Joseph. Joseph seemed to consistently, even at a young age, remember his life was not about him. He knew the stories about Abraham and Isaac and his father and the promises that were made and what was ahead for their family. At least the hope side of it. Didn't know exactly what it looked like, but they knew, at least he knew, that he was in God's hands. Amen. And so Joseph, he finds himself in prison. So again, life is all messed up. Thinking up to at least age 17, he's thinking, I've got it made. I'm the favorite. I got a nice coat. I don't have to work like my brother. I kind of look ahead and see, Dad's going to give me some extra stuff. This is going to work out well for me. And then all of a sudden, life just takes a nosedive. Well, while he's there in prison, we learn that some type of episode takes place. And so Pharaoh has his chief cupbearer and his chief baker both put into this prison. Now, while they're there in the prison, they meet Joseph. Joseph's in charge of all the prisoners. But then, after they're there for a while, they each have a dream. Now, just like with Joseph's dream earlier, it's really God's dream. God gives the dream to Joseph and the ability to interpret it. God gives the dream to the cupbearer and the baker, and then Joseph the ability to interpret. And the dreams don't stop there. But at least what happens with these two guys, they have their dreams, they're perplexed by it. Joseph sees that they're perplexed by their dreams, they're trying to figure out what's going on. And so Joseph says, well, tell me your dream. And so the cupbearer goes first. He tells Joseph his dream, and it's like, wow, that works out pretty well. Because the end of the story, what Joseph says is Pharaoh is going to restore you back to your position as chief cupbearer. Well, the baker's kind of excited. It's like, oh, that worked out pretty good for the cupbearer. Let me tell Joseph my dream. So the baker tells him his dream, and it doesn't work out so well. Rather, Joseph tells him, there's bad news. Pharaoh's going to take you out of prison, but then you're going to be hanged. You're going to die. Well, 3 days later, it's Pharaoh's birthday. Pharaoh calls the chief cupbearer and the chief baker from prison. They come before him, and just like Joseph said, he restores the chief cupbearer back to his place. He's the guy that, before the Pharaoh would drink something, he would taste it, to make sure it's not poison. So it's a pretty big responsibility. So maybe there's a coup or something going on, who knows. Well, the chief baker, though, sure enough, just like Joseph had told him from the dream, he's hanged. There's hope here, perhaps, for Joseph, because he nails it with both dreams. And here's a guy who's right there in the present. He's a very important person to the Pharaoh, but instead we see that the cupbearer, he forgets about Joseph. 2 years goes by. But don't things like that happen in our lives consistently? We get to this point that it's like I can see the light at the end of the tunnel, and I feel hopeful, and it's like, oh, finally some relief. And then all of a sudden we're let down, and the rug is just yanked out from under us again. And I'm sure that was a point like this for Joseph, that he gets there, and it's like, oh, finally I'm going to get out of prison. Again, I have the most important job below the prison warden of anybody in the prison, but he's still in prison. And so now the cupbearer, he's got Pharaoh's ear. This is going to work out well. It doesn't. 2 years go by. And at the end of this 2 years, Pharaoh has a couple of dreams. And Joseph is going to get to shine. Charles Colson. I heard about Charles Colson later. I was a little kid during the Watergate years, and so I didn't really know anything about him at that point in time. But Colson was a political strategist, and he was special counsel to President Nixon. And with the Watergate hearings, he was never convicted, but he pled guilty to crimes and had to go to jail. But in jail, he found Jesus. Being in jail completely transformed his life. And Colson had this to say: whatever good I may have done is because God saw fit to reach into the depths of Watergate and convert a broken sinner. So, convicted of his sin, he didn't deny that he had done wrong. He had pled guilty. He went to jail, but then made a difference, not only in his own life, but in the lives of many others through prison fellowship ministry, as well as other organizations that he helped to start that continue on today, even after his death. But it wasn't until the depths. Again, you're right there and have the ear of the president, and then you go to jail. And his eternity was transformed as a result of that. And again, avoidance of pain. On the surface, it seems best. But we're called to trust God. Sure, we can try to avoid it, as long as that's not why we exist. We exist to have a relationship with God. Well, God was at work like this in Joseph's life. So Joseph continues to grow in his faith, but now he's given this opportunity. Joseph goes and interprets Pharaoh's dreams. Now, he has two dreams. Joseph's going to tell him that they're both the same dream. But one of the dreams is there are 7 just fat, healthy, just good cows. They come up out of the Nile. And then 7 lean, ugly cows come up behind them. And those 7 lean, ugly cows, they eat the 7 healthy cows, but they don't get any bigger. They just stay lean and ugly. Then there's a second dream. These 7 healthy, full heads of grain, they come forth. and then 7 scrawny, ugly heads of grain come up, and somehow the second group consumes the first group, but again, the second group, it's not any healthier. It's not any better. They're still ugly. Joseph says, your dream, they're one and the same dream. God has told Pharaoh what's going to take place in the future. The 7 fat, healthy cows, the 7 good heads of grain, are 7 years of plenty. And so the land of Egypt is going to have 7 years where the crops produce, they flourish, 7 years of plenty. But following these 7, there will be 7 years of famine. And so what Pharaoh needs to do is you need to begin working now and preparing during those 7 healthy years, those 7 years of plenty, to get ready for the 7 years of famine. And so things need to be stored. You need to do these percentages and work stuff out like this. And then here's Pharaoh's response. Again, think about this. A guy who's a sheep herder from Canaan, a slave, in prison, dialogue with the most powerful man in the world at that point in time, the Pharaoh of Egypt. And then Egypt said to Joseph, since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the whole land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took a signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and men shouted before him, make way! Thus he put him in charge of the whole land of Egypt. God's dreams. So here's a guy who goes from having the best in his family to the lowest he possibly could be in the world, to all of a sudden, he is the second most powerful man in the most powerful nation on earth. Second only to Pharaoh himself. Now we're told in Genesis that Joseph is 30 years old when this takes place. So let that sink in for a moment. He's sold by his brothers into slavery when he's 17. So almost half of his life he is spent in slavery and is spent in prison. And he rises up from that to become second most powerful person in the world. Don't we underestimate God way too many times? No doubt God has his hand in this whole scenario. The dreams that are given to Joseph, the dreams to those in prison, the dreams to Pharaoh. Well, the 7 years of plenty come. Joseph, he's in charge of storing stuff during these years, and so 20% is collected every year and saved. Then the 7 years of plenty are over, and then the famine starts. And so now the distribution of food takes place among the people of Egypt because the crops aren't producing. And slowly, food in the rest of the world is running out, so people from other places are now coming. So imagine this. Egypt is the only place where you can get food. And so the wealth of Egypt, the power of Egypt, how it grows. And remember the promises made to Abraham? I will bless those who will bless you. And every time somebody takes care of Joseph, God takes care of them just as much as he takes care of Joseph. And so the land of Egypt, Pharaoh's kingdom, is blessed in a way beyond, I'm sure they could even imagine at this point in time. Well, when the famine comes severe enough, Jacob and his family up in Canaan, they run out of food. Jacob learns that there's grain in Egypt, and so then, like everybody else, people have to be sent down to Egypt to get food to bring back so they don't starve to death. So Jacob sends his 10 sons, the 10 sons who had sold Joseph into slavery. Joseph, in the meantime, has had a little brother. His name is Benjamin, but he's now Jacob's favorite. He's lost Joseph. They both have the same mom, Rachel. But he doesn't want to let Benjamin go. So he sends the 10 down to Egypt, and when they arrive in Egypt, these 10 brothers, guess who they got to go see? They got to go see the guy who's in charge of all the food. And lo and behold, it's Joseph. And in verses 8 and 9, it says, although Joseph recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. In 13, 14 years have now, let's do the math again. 13 years go by, now 7 more years of famine, so 20 years, and then maybe another year of the famine time. So 21, almost 22 years have gone by since these 10 have sold Joseph into slavery. Okay. Then he remembered his dream about them. And he said to them, you are spies. You have come to see where our land is unprotected. See, I'm thinking if I'm Joseph, this is going to be great. I'm going to have a good old time with my brothers. It's payback time. Now, there's some disciplining that does take place. He puts them in custody for 3 days. But then he sends them back home, but Simeon has to stay behind. And he stays in prison while they go back home. So they go back home, they have grain, they get home to eat, but he tells them, when you come back the next time, you got to bring your little brother. You got to prove to me that he's okay. You got to bring Benjamin back. And so they go home, they tell Jacob, here's what happened. We had to leave poor Simeon there and leave him in jail. This guy was scary. And he told us if we ever have to come back again, if we want Simeon, we got to take Benjamin. Now, I don't know if Simeon ever learns this, but Jacob's like, no, you're not taking Benjamin back. So I don't care how long Simeon's in jail, Benjamin is not going down to the land of Egypt. But instead, the food runs out. Because remember, the famine, it's going to last for 7 years. And so their food eventually runs out. They're going to have to go back to Egypt again. And they said, Dad, we got to take Benjamin with us. And he didn't want them to. But then Judah says, I'll take responsibility. It'll be my fault. I'll sacrifice my life for his. That type of thing. And so we can begin to see that these guys have changed. They're truly repentant of what they did to their little brother Joseph. Just Joseph doesn't know that yet. So they get back to Egypt. They have Benjamin with them. Joseph gets to meet his little brother Benjamin for the first time. And again, it's fascinating to read the story and the stuff that takes place and how Joseph lavishes things on Benjamin. It says, now Joseph gave these instructions to the steward of his house. Fill the men's sacks with as much food as they can carry, and put each man's silver in the mouth of his sack. Then put my cup, the silver one, in the mouth of the youngest one's sack, along with the silver for his grain. And he did as Joseph said. So they come to buy grain, he gives them the grain, puts the money back in their bags, but then he takes Joseph's silver cup and puts it in Benjamin's sack. The brothers leave to head back to Canaan, and then Joseph sends his steward after them. They catch up with them. So it's sort of like shoplifting. Once you get out of the store, now you're guilty. And so they stop them. The steward starts with the oldest. He's the one that put it in the sack, but he knows. Joseph has given him instructions. He starts with the oldest, works down to the youngest. They dump it out, and there's the silver cup. Benjamin's in big trouble. He stole this from the second in command of Egypt. He's got to go back and face the penalty for his crimes. Well, they all go back, and you can imagine the brothers are freaking out. It's like, we can't leave Benjamin here. He's our father's favorite. It will kill our father. So Joseph is hearing all of this. Again, he's seeing that there's genuine repentance on their parts. That it'll kill our father? No. And then Judah offers to stay. Let Benjamin go home. I'll stay here. And we pick up with the account. Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still living? But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. And you keep it 22 years of guilt, and now getting the daylight scared out of you with the incident with Benjamin. Then Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed, and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will not be plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. What a phenomenal person. 17 years old, 22 years has gone by. He forgives his brothers, but he recognizes and understands why he's here. And he's never stopped being faithful and seeking to honor God. You know, Romans 8:28 tells us, and we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. See, the reason Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and their descendants are important is because Jesus would be coming into the world. And so God is working to preserve his family, to preserve the lineage through whom Jesus is going to come into the world. Now, if you read in Genesis, in the middle of this, there's a story with Judah. And you see that Judah marries a Canaanite woman, and then there's problems that he has, and there's problems with his children. And what you begin to see is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, their families are being influenced by the people of Canaan. So not only does God save their lives by providing food in Egypt, he gets them away from that terrible influence. They come down to Egypt, but even though they're Joseph's family and the Egyptians are accommodating to them, they're sheep herders. And Egyptians, they don't mingle or associate with sheep herders. So come here to Egypt, we're going to give you your own place. You can live in the land of Goshen. And so not only are they separated from the influence of Canaan, when they arrive in Egypt, they're even separated from the influence there in Egypt. And now God's got his people back to where they can focus on him without all of these worldly influences around them. God working all things to the good for those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. See, God doesn't deviate away from his purposes. Will Mancini in his book says, true freedom is not doing anything you want to do, but giving all of yourself to what God has called you to. So I think we think freedom is I can do anything I want, I can do everything that I want, whenever I want. No. True freedom is we're freed from the bondage of sin, and we're freed up to have a relationship with God. We're freed up to give ourselves completely to what God has called us to do. See, God wants a relationship with us. Through the Bible, consistently, that's the story. But here in the world, the lower story, it's a roller coaster ride. It's up and down, up and down. But God calls us to walk by faith. A faith that leads to obedience. Randy Frazee, the author of the story, as far as the series, God's the author of the Bible, but Randy Frazee has this to say, God's upper story weaves a tale of relentless pursuit. He doesn't just desire to turn whatever was intended for evil to good in your life. He wants you. Let that sink in. We don't exist just so God can make our lives smooth, or so that God can take bad things and turn them around into good things. God wants us. He wants you to be with you, to have fellowship with you. What he calls us to do is to be faithful today. Tomorrow, when he gets here, to be faithful tomorrow. As we conclude today, I want to use this as an invitation time. If you've not yet accepted Jesus as your Lord and Savior, what we see throughout the story, what we see in the life of Joseph, God wants us. See, everything else in this creation is going to be destroyed. Even these physical bodies are going to be destroyed. Our spirit continues to live on. He'll give us a new body, but that's it. The Bible and our spirits, that's it from this creation that's going to continue on into eternity. And that's what God wants. But each of us, we have the power to either give it or not. And that's our choice. If you'd like to find out more about how to do that or what that